Hi, all. So, up until this point, we have really been dealing with social studies methods and teaching at a really broad level, right? We have been thinking about expanding our ideas of the kind of questions that we ask and the understandings. We've looked at standards. We've started to think critically about the textbooks in front of us, but we've been operating at a really high level, right? A high thinking level. And I want to use this asynchronous session this week for us to really kind of dig in and apply and see how, even if our class were to stop right now, right, before we ever got into any of the details around historical thinking, for example, or reading or writing or any of that, that if we were to stop right now, we already have a critical lens to think about interacting with the curriculum and the materials and the standards that are handed to us. And we can already start thinking like a critical social studies teacher about the topics in front of us. Okay, so we're going to use this asynchronous session to apply what we've been learning, and we're going to do it in two ways. We're going to apply it through our inquiry blog, the topics that we're doing for the blog and for our final unit. And then we're going to do it through a pre-written curriculum. We're going to work in small groups and we're going to apply it to a pre-written curriculum. So that this is really your chance to put these pieces together. And in this short lecture, and keep it short, in this short lecture, I am going to come back to some of the ideas that we've talked about, but maybe in a little bit more depth to set you up for success with those two applications. Okay, let's go back to last session where I know we gave no attention at all, right, to the assigned readings, which were really important around counter narratives and thinking more deeply and critically about the topics that we cover in the curriculum and thinking about the lies, really, that curriculum can perpetuate. So I want to encourage you to do something. I want you to think about the article that you chose to read. So remember, there was a long menu of articles, and if you didn't read one, please do so because it's illuminating, right? And you can pick any of those topics. I want you to think about that topic. So let's say you pick the one on FDR and the New Deal. I want you to find someone, maybe a classmate, a roommate, an instructor, and interview. I say that loosely, but ask them, what do they know about your topic? What do people know about, for example, FDR and the New Deal? Or, for example, what do people know about why Brown versus Board was ultimately passed? So if I were to interview someone about that, I might get an answer like, although not necessarily, but typically when I ask people, they might tell me something like, the civil rights movement had reached a breaking point where we knew that segregation had to end. It was the moral thing to do. It was the right thing to do. The time had just come, right? That most people, when they think of Brown v. Board, that's the explanation that they might give. When I ask someone what they know, I'm not going to share what I read in my article. I just simply want you to hear what their perspective is and take that as kind of like a representation of the dominant perspective on your topic, the majoritarian narrative or the dominant narrative. The reason that I'm asking you to do this is because I then want you to think about how does that dominant narrative compare to the perspective presented in the article. If you were able to talk to your fellow classmates, I would then have you think about how those untold narratives, what they have in common. But how does it compare to the perspective presented in the article? If I asked someone about Brown v. Board, and I had been reading work, for example, Carol Anderson has done some important historical work on the history of Brown v. Board. That narrative that I shared is really different than what, for example, Carol Anderson or Derek Bell uncover in their historical research, which is the United States, that Brown was part of Cold War strategy, that the United States was actually shamed at the UN about their segregationist policies. The NAACP petitioned the UN on behalf of African Americans, asking the UN to intervene on behalf of the human rights violations experienced by African Americans in the United States. That the Soviet Union held this up as a reason to discredit the United States moral authority related to democracy and communism, and that there was a clear political strategy um, in the U.S. that we had to do something to save face, right? It's also true that the civil rights movement was effective. Part of the civil rights movement's strategy, however, was also to appeal to global ideas of human rights. So I would just simply notice that these two narratives are different, right? The common dominant majoritarian narrative about Brown v. Board versus what historians have uncovered, that those are different narratives. We might also see this, for example, if we were to look at and explore issues around the Civil War and narratives around the Civil War, but also any of the topics that you looked at, right? FDR and the New Deal, for example, that one keeps coming back to mind. The Black Panthers, right? Any of them. So what does it mean for our teaching that these different narratives exist out in the world, and how do we uncover them? Particularly when, as teachers, we are tasked with covering a broad swath of curriculum that we're not an expert in every element of, right? You haven't taken a history class in every single topic that you're going to be tasked with teaching. You haven't taken a political science class in every single topic that you've been tasked with teaching. At some point, you have to pause and think about, are there frameworks that I can use to help me know what I don't know and what my students don't know? And before I share some of those frameworks, I want to remind us that there are equity implications to unearthing these narratives that differ from the dominant or majoritarian narratives. I have a link in D2L to a TED Talk by the Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie called The Danger of a Single Story. I feel like most people these days have watched that at some point in their undergraduate career, so I didn't assign it. But if you haven't watched it before, oh my gosh, please do. It is a really powerful explanation of the danger of dominant narratives and single stories. And Adichie, like Ladson Billings, makes an argument that these limited narratives that we tell have equity implications. That in fact, these limited narratives, these majoritarian narratives that emphasize a single story that is not fully true, it may be partly true, but it's not fully true, serves in part to do what James Baldwin warned us of, right, in a talk to teachers, that these partial narratives, these majoritarian narratives, these single stories, that they serve to uphold a mythology. And that instead, and that mythology marginalizes students of color, immigrant students, queer students. It can marginalize low-income students. It can marginalize students who fit outside that dominant narrative or who have a different perspective. So one of the tools that we have to work with is something called a counter-narrative. A counter-narrative, that expression actually does come from critical race theory. And it's the idea that we can talk back to majoritarian narratives, dominant narratives, common sense narratives, that by sharing stories from the margins or perspectives from the margins. So while counter-narrative, that phrase or that word, is popularized by critical race theory in academic spaces, it's not an idea that only exists there. For example, in Jesuit teachings and in liberation theology and in Ignatian pedagogy, we talk about people of the periphery, and we talk about the epistemic privilege that people of the periphery bring, and that we are called to listen to those who have experienced oppression and marginalization because they speak with a particular power. That idea is the same, right, as the critical race theory idea of a counter-narrative. It's about uncovering the stories from the margins that challenge dominant narratives. Now, when we say that it challenges dominant narratives or that the stories are from the margins, this isn't to say if we're in a history class, it means that these are historical accounts, evidentiary accounts, well-reasoned accounts that present a different interpretation of historical narratives. So, for example, if I go back to the example of Brown, the work that Carol Anderson and Derek Bell have done uncovering the Cold War implications of segregation in the United States and the role of Brown in foreign policy related to the Cold War, that is a counter narrative, right? It's a perspective that challenges the dominant narrative to be a more complete narrative. So I introduced this to you in class last week, but these questions, essentially, the critical historian's essential questions, essentially are a way to interact with a text and begin to identify what that narrative that we're reading in that text is presenting and what may be missing from it. So we ask questions like, what is the evidence in this particular text? Is this a logical conclusion or narrative based on the evidence? Can I trust this source? We also ask questions about whose perspective does this source represent and whose perspective is missing? How would this narrative be different if told from a different perspective? Where is the bias in this perspective? And what is the enduring legacy of this narrative? Like, why would this be a narrative that people would forward or multiply or propagate in the world? And we can use these questions to interact with any text or topic in the social studies, but they're a particularly powerful tool when we are coming to a topic anew, when we may not be an expert in a topic. These become our thinking tool, or if you think back to an early class when I talked about visible thinking routines, these become a visible thinking routine for assessing a text and beginning to think about where we can look to identify what we don't know. Now, those questions you can see also overlap with this idea of understanding. And understanding, remember, is not just about meeting standards. It's not just about retaining content. Understanding is about being able to use what we learn to transfer it to new settings, to apply it, and to use it as a schema to make sense of the world. So we have all of these different types of understanding and examples of it. And you can see how many of these types of understanding are in response to, or can respond to, the questions that a critical historian asks, or the critical essential questions. And then those big understandings, those critical essential questions, those counter narratives can also help us shape the big questions or the essential questions that we ask about our topic that guide inquiry into our topic. Okay, so we've talked about essential questions and understanding in the past. What I want to do now is I want to give you some examples and explain how you're going to apply this. Okay, let's say that I am teaching a world history class and I am looking at the curriculum. And the curriculum is topical, it's chronological. It's going to tell me that I need to cover, ancient societies and medieval Europe, and then imperialism, and then the New World, right? And then it basically moves into modern US and European history. Okay, so I've got a chronology, and then I've got the standards. As I am thinking about understandings, I am trying to articulate the big ideas, the important ideas, the enduring ideas that can help students really focus on what matters in this topic. So here are some examples of big ideas or enduring understandings that might exist in a world history class. Every history is told from a biased perspective. And the common wisdom of history is sometimes more myth than fact. That could be an enduring understanding to guide an entire world history course that sets the frame for how we interrogate texts. I also might think of something like history is full of gray areas and people are never just good or bad guys. Right? That helps me also think about bias and perspective. You can see more examples here. I won't read them all, but these are all some of the big ideas or enduring understandings that I might cover in a world history class. I can frame, if here are others that I can frame from a world history class, right? Or other historical classes that are maybe more content specific. So these are really broad, enduring understandings that might guide an entire course, right? Um, Another one that I love, geography and the natural world have starring roles in world history. Then I can think about having enduring understandings of specific units. So here are examples of different enduring understandings that might guide different units in my world history class. In the name of democracy, the US has engaged in some very undemocratic action. The Dark Ages may have been dark for Europe, but not for the rest of the world. Guns, germs, steel, and horses changed the fate of the Americas. Globalization can be seen as an extension of colonialism and imperialism. So you can see that these big ideas, I'm phrasing them as a big unifying concept that the facts and the details help us to see, and that often draw on counter narratives in order to make the point. So, as we are engaging with big ideas and questions and counter narratives and understandings and all of that, another piece that we've talked about is relevance, right? Connecting our curriculum to our students' lives. And so, another question that I encourage you to wrestle with is how your topic is connected to Milwaukee. And I want you to think about finding a resource connected to your topic that is also connected to our local context. Because what you're going to do in your first asynchronous task for this week is you are going to locate a source. I'm going to skim here to the individual inquiry unit and blog planning that you could use in your placement to teach about your topic. Any source. It can be from a textbook, popular media, an academic article. You're going to use the critical historian's questions, the ones that I showed you, that circle, to interrogate your text source. And I want you to actually write out the answers as if you were a student answering those questions about a text that your teacher assigned. And then you're going to move down here to this discussion. And you're going to answer the following questions for your classmates. So what is your topic? Tell us what source you selected, and then summarize. When you answered those questions, what does that reveal about this text or source and about your topic more broadly? Does it reveal holes in the narratives? Does it reveal more clearly the majoritarian narrative versus the counter narrative? Does it reveal something else, right? Does it reveal what kind of texts you might need to look at? But what does interrogating that text critically help you see? Then I want you also to include one standard, just one. Pick one standard that you think connects to the kind of thinking that you could do related to your topic. And then I want you to find at least one source that links your topic, what I just mentioned, to an issue of local significance. And then based on all of that, the standards, your critical reading, background knowledge, local article, I want you to try to articulate an enduring understanding and an essential question about your blog topic, your inquiry unit topic. I also am going to encourage you to come back after you post and respond to your peers, not just by saying good job, but by giving them feedback on their essential questions and enduring understandings and helping them refine these ideas that they may uncover. Okay, so that is your task, building on everything that we've done so far. And you can see from everything that we've done in class so far, if you get to that point and we're working on building our discussion skills, we have a way to design a lesson that prioritizes student sense making because it's centered on a question. It's centered on students making sense of a text. And we're already moving beyond simply the delivery of content to instead thinking about the texts and the narratives that we encounter.